I'd like to welcome everyone tonight to our 5th session in the Natural Area Management Services webinar series, Advanced Level 2, brought to you by the Woods in Your Backyard Partnership. That's a cooperative effort of the University of Maryland Extension, Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Penn State Extension, and the Virginia Department of Forestry. Funding for this webinar was made possible in part by a grant from the Harry R. Hughes Center for Agroecology at the University of Maryland. We are kicking off Woodland Management Week this week. As I was saying, we started off the series with Week 1 Wildlife Week. We continued last week with Tree Planting and Water Week, and this week, Woodland Management Week. Tonight, we're going to be discussing applying woodland health practices to different successional stages. And then Thursday night, we'll be dealing with woodland management, harvesting on single or multiple properties. So tonight, understanding woodland health practices and the ecological and silvicultural principles that underlie their application will help woodland health professionals implement them on their clients' properties. It'll also help them educate their customers on the need to implement specific woodland health practices in both hardwood and pine woodlands. Tonight's presentations will examine early to late successional woodland habitats from young to mature forests and the woodland health practices that apply to each, including chosen tree management, also called crop tree management, timber stand improvement practices, including dealing with vines, and intermediate versus regeneration treatments that apply to each. Before we get started, we have the housekeeping items to talk about. You heard Agnes there briefly. She's behind the scenes making me, yeah, there she is. Hi, Agnes. She's keeping me on my toes. I'm Andrew Kling. We're both with the University of Maryland Extension Woodland Stewardship Education Program. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for registering. We say it every week, but we mean it, because if you weren't here, we'd have nothing to talk about. I do want to remind you that the webinar is being recorded. When you joined us this evening, your video camera was turned off and your microphone was muted, and please make sure they stay that way. That makes everyone's experience the best possible as we go forward. And when the recording is available, we'll post it on our YouTube channel and we'll send out an email, let everyone know where the webinar is available. And also by joining us live tonight, you have the opportunity to acquire continuing education credits. You can't get them by just watching the recording. You have to be here live. And there are a number of associations that are saying, yes, we'll give you education credits for joining us. ISA, SAF, Licensed Tree Expert in Maryland, Delaware, Master Logger, and a number of others. And the way we do that is we take the Zoom report, the Zoom attendance report at the end of the evening, and we compare that to the folks who registered, put the email addresses together, and then we'll email out you a certificate, a blank certificate, which you can then fill out and send to the association of your choice to get those education credits. And we've also talked a little bit about the Q&A function and the chat function. I'll talk a little bit more about them now. Make sure that we repeat the distinction between the two. The question and answer button with the 2 cartoon bubbles, the little widget down at the bottom of your screen, that's if you have a specific question for one of the presenters. And we keep them until the end of the evening from that 8 to 8:30 block. That's when we open things up to those questions. So if you have a comment during the presentation, something piques your interest, or you have a general comment, or you want to share a link that you find interesting, put that in the chat box. That's the best place for that. And we have a number of professionals from the Woods in Your Backyard Partnership on with us tonight. So there might be conversation going back and forth between the participants and the professionals. So that's the best place for that to take place, in the chat. One of the other things we've had mentioned to us as feedback, and I mentioned this last week, I'll mention it again. It's a function of Zoom that when the program is going and people are active in the chat box, there's a little pop-up that says so-and-so has said such and such. And there are some people who are distracted by that. If you find that that's distracting, click or tap on the chat icon. And what that'll do is bring up the chat as a separate panel next to the presentation. It won't scroll as things are going on, so it might be a little less distracting from the actual presentation. And if you discover that you don't like that, just tap on the on the chat icon again, and the panel will disappear and you'll be able to go back. Unfortunately, we can't do anything about those little pop-ups. That's something that's built into Zoom, but I do want to let you know that that's one way to deal with it. And as I said, this is the 5th of 8 presentations. We have one on Thursday and then 2 more next week, last one being on Thursday the 18th. And within a week of the conclusion of the webinar series, we'll be sending out an evaluation. And we really do appreciate whatever feedback you can give us. Let us know what you liked. Let us know where we can improve, because this is really essential in helping us build programming going forward. Let us know if you like the webinar format, if you'd like something a little different. You know, once we can get back to doing workshops face-to-face, would you rather do that? All of that is very important to us. Let us know what you think. Now, let me tell you a little bit about tonight's speakers. We have Jonathan Kays, who's a forestry specialist with the University of Maryland Extension at the Western Maryland Research and Education Center. I should know the name of it. I work there. And Sara Wurzbacher, who's a forestry educator with Penn State Extension. Jonathan is a forestry specialist with the University of Maryland Extension with over 30 years of experience in teaching, research, and technical assistance. He has developed and implemented extension programs in woodland stewardship, invasive species management, wildlife damage management, natural resource income opportunities, handheld GPS, and wood biomass energy production. He is one of the primary authors of the Woods in Your Backyard Guide, first published in 2006 and revised in 2015. Jonathan has authored numerous extension publications, and he produces a free quarterly newsletter called Branching Out. Additional resources that are available at our website, extension.umd.edu/woodland. Sara Wurzbacher is a Penn State forestry extension educator based in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, whose work has involved a variety of ecological systems nationally and internationally, but she is most at home in the forests of Pennsylvania's Allegheny Plateau and Ridge and Valley regions. Her current work focuses on Pennsylvania forest management issues, especially regeneration silviculture, forest health, landscape scale successional diversification, wildlife habitat enhancement, incentivizing good stewardship and creative silviculture, increasing utilization of low-value wood, proactively managing invasive plant and insect threats, and increasing diverse participation in natural resource professions. So Sara is going to be going first tonight. Sara, you ready to go?
Absolutely.
Okay, I am going to stop sharing my screen and I will turn off my video and I will turn things over to you.
Welcome, everyone. So I've adapted a talk for this evening to introduce the concepts of applying woodland health practices to different successional stages with a focus on hardwood silviculture. The program I've adapted is a general sort of introduction to silviculture program that I've given to some landowner groups. And I think it's useful even for professionals to think in these terms, because often, we as professionals understand the basics of silviculture and the concepts behind different forest management practices, but being able to communicate the context in place for each of those to clients is particularly important. And I think it's useful to kind of frame it in a successional lens to make the most sense of things. My dog's going to be loud through the whole thing. I'm sorry. All right, so let's kind of launch into it. As we know, we can think of succession in two ways, and if this is of interest to clients, it's, I suppose, something that's worth covering. That there's a difference between primary succession, a process, post-glaciation, major disturbance that happens over thousands of years to result in that sort of pioneer forest condition, versus secondary succession, which is that rotational kind of system that we see on the landscape, mediated by a few hundred-year scale of disturbance, maturation of forest, and then continuous disturbance. And this is really where most of our conversations in forest management in this region take place, is in this whole system of secondary succession. We can think about succession in a number of ways, but to a landowner or to a client who you might be working with, they may come to the conversation around succession in relationship to their goals. Each of these different successional stages involves different functional conditions, different structural conditions that result in different habitat features, different potential, and a different trajectory for the stand. Each of those stages has unique factors that make it that make a sort of smaller portfolio of what is an acceptable or desirable activity to take place in that successional stage. Functionally, when we talk about structure, we often talk about succession in terms of what the dynamics of the stand are doing at any given time. In those early stages, the initiation of a stand leading to stem exclusion where competition is extremely fierce, and we start to see differentiation of winners and losers in the stand, those that will make up the main canopy and those that will drop out, followed by understory reinitiation, where we start to see that understory become developed and maybe even some smaller seedlings. And sometimes this conversation ends in a complex stage where there is some sort of pattern of predictable disturbance that we can sort of follow that mediates these stand dynamics all over again on a smaller scale. So whenever I present to landowner groups, I usually like to run through a series of very famous slides from the Arnot tract in the Allegheny National Forest, where a photo was taken of a regenerating stand every 10 years over a 90-year period to kind of reinforce some of these successional dynamics. One of the biggest misconceptions among the general public and landowners and folks you might be interacting with on a professional basis is that forests are static. You know, if they've inherited a forest or purchased a forest, they may have only seen a 20, 30-year window max of what's been happening in that forest. And in mature forests, which is what we mostly see in this region, things tend to look the same from one moment to the next. But we know as managers that there's a lot going on in there. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I know you have a good understanding of succession and you've already discussed it as part of this series, but I like to go through these slides to kind of just reinforce the general practices that we hack into or co-opt as part of our silvicultural practice. So here is, you know, an even-aged overstory removal. We've taken off the mature forest and we have a cohort of young seedlings that is this sudden pulse of light for them. They're ready to take off. There's extreme competition at this stage. These seedlings are very small. They were there in advance of the overstory removal, of the removal of the big trees, which is an important factor I'll kind of come back to throughout this presentation. And that competition begins. It's only really subtraction from here. You start with what you've got, and then things begin to die over time. In 10 years, the stand looks quite different. These are, you know, small diameter stems, but in a 10-year-old stand, there are still 20, 30,000 trees in an acre, which might eventually become 200, 400. So there's a lot of death in front of us at this stage. And what's mediating that is the intense competition at this stage, fighting for position, fighting for dominance. And in another 10 years, we start to see something that begins to take shape as a forest. We have a closed canopy condition. And we begin to see the differentiation in size of species that have a faster growth strategy, something like black cherry, versus a slower growth strategy with more shade tolerance, ready to sort of persist in that intermediate condition, sugar maple. In another 10 years, we see that differentiation perpetuate itself. You know, we see evidence of that these early successional species that don't hold on for very long are still present in the stand, like aspen. But once again, those early winners continue to win as long as they are in those dominant positions. This one cherry that had a slight edge at the beginning is much larger than his buddy, who's the same age, the same species on exactly the same site, just given his crown position. And again, these sugar maples are kind of just hanging out. In another 10 years, we see that same differentiation take place. And in 10 years after that, we see the aspen drop out. So early successional species, you know, not long for the life of the stand, drop out and with a sudden pulse of light. So we're seeing this evidence of these mortality patterns that continue to occur over time. But with that pulse of light, we're going to see that gap close very quickly because it's not a mature stand yet and everything's sort of fighting for position. In 10 years where that aspen has dropped out, if you notice between this photo from 10 years prior and this photo 10 years later, the cherry that was closest to that gap was able to kind of catch up a bit in terms of growth. And the same is true for left side maple over here, which suddenly looks a little bit happier. Again, light is really the mediating success mechanism in these stands. Another 10 years, we're starting to lose track of what was different about these in the first place, these two cherries, because they've persisted on the site, but we have a lot less trees in this stand, and we see evidence of them all over the ground. In another 10 years, we finally see left side maple wins, right side maple loses. Evidence further that the mortality continues, the density continues to decrease as trees get larger. And we're starting to kind of see this as a typical mature forest that we recognize now at this point. A landowner sort of walking into this condition would not think about the dynamics that led to this condition, but we've kind of seen it all play out in this series of slides. Ending with the most recent photo, something that makes a lot of sense to us, what we see every day in our work and what's very common on the landscape, where we have some understory reinitiation, some differentiated stem structure, and also some non-native plants kind of showing up in the understory. So this is sort of a typical successional pathway, and I think it's always useful to kind of explain how those stand dynamics occur, because it becomes a baseline for our conversations around how to do good forest management and enact good health practices to make sure that these conditions are successful, that lead us to a place we want to go in the stand. And what do we do from there? So generally speaking, summing this up for a landowner, successional stages are mediated by intense competition. We begin with a very large number of stems that are very small, and we end with a much smaller number of stems that are very large. It's very simple, it's elementary stuff, but the mechanisms that mediate these tendencies in succession are two: recruitment, which happens in even age stands all at once in the beginning and a little bit in the reinitiation stage, and mortality, which occurs all along the trajectory of succession, but especially at those beginning stages. And I will kind of focus most of my comments today on those sort of earlier stand practices, because a lot of the health practices that we do are about understanding that mortality is going to happen anyway. But if we choose what we remove, if we put the mortality where we want it and assign that expected mortality, we can have a really positive benefit on what continues to survive in the stand and what persists to a later condition. So if we, again, think of those stages as those functional conditions and we understand those mechanisms, we think about the mechanism of mortality, and naturally that's something like fire or wind throw or an insect outbreak. Those are unpredictable disturbances and causes of mortality, but our management is active versions of that mortality. Those recruitment procedures, again, are regeneration or planting or seeding, things that tend to happen in the beginning stages of the stand. So silviculture, you've heard probably a number of different definitions of what silviculture is, but for me, it's understanding that succession and disturbance regime, the ecology of the system that we understand and expect, using that, sort of moving it, leveraging it to our advantage, or hacking the system, so to speak, to inform our management actions in order to reach objectives. We're not fighting against a system to create a condition that's hard to get on the site. Rather, we should understand where the stand is going and make decisions that kind of move it toward a more desirable condition for our objectives. And so what that means, or what that translates to, is that any sort of silvicultural action or health practice that you are doing in a stand for a landowner really must focus on what is being left behind in the stand rather than what's being removed. All of our actions are focused on the benefit of the stand after we walk out of there, rather than just, we're going to take this, we're going to take this, we're going to take that. This is true even at the phase at which we're beginning a new forest and we're doing like a big saw timber harvest, because we're focusing on when we pull out of here, when all the skidders are gone, when all the harvest equipment is gone, what's that next forest going to look like? And that's kind of the guiding principle of good silviculture. And again, we can kind of place our activities of things like release, thinning, and crop tree in that successional context as ways to advance succession, co-opt the mortality and assign it where we want it, rather than wait for mortality to occur through natural competition. Similarly, when we do large-scale disturbances like regeneration treatments, we're intentionally moving succession backwards, but we want to do it in a planned way where we know what the result is going to be. So I talked about sort of two different categories, stand replacement and stand tending. It's useful, maybe the most useful way to contextualize a silvicultural activity for a landowner is whether it's an intermediate treatment or whether it is a regeneration treatment. Any intermediate treatment is meant to foster stand conditions forward in succession. So you're trying to take a forest and move it toward a more mature condition. You're co-opting that mortality and kind of moving things forward. And a regeneration treatment is meant to replace the stand with a younger forest condition. So a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today, cleaning treatments, crop tree, thinning, some of those other practices that Andrew mentioned, all sort of belong in this intermediate stage. We're not trying to make huge, big holes in the canopy and regenerate the forest and create young forest conditions. Rather, we're trying to take an immature stand and move it toward a healthier, mature condition. So we're going to start our conversation here in the intermediate treatments. And I'm going to go through, a few different examples, and then we'll move on and talk a bit about some regeneration treatments as well. So if we start with sort of our earliest opportunity to intervene in a young stand, let's kind of return to, the 5-10 year mark after we have a big pulse of light and a lot of seedlings regenerating. Cleaning and weeding treatments or early stand tending occurs in this very, very early window. It is always a pre-commercial activity. The trees in this forest are an inch, half an inch in diameter. And no matter what kind of biomass market you have, there's no logistical way to do any activity in here that is going to make you any money. It's very labor intensive to work in these stands. And the decisions we make and the removals we do at this stage are, one stem at a time, and they're messy, and you're running around in there, and it's a whole thing. So the objectives of doing anything in this stand this early is that because that competition is so intense at this stage, you really have a great opportunity to influence the outcome of the race and the competition that's happening, so that what is desirable in this mix has the best chance of success. Once again, from this point on, everything happens in a stand by subtraction. Things are gonna die. So if we kill a few things intentionally around something we hope will succeed, it suddenly has space. It doesn't have to work as hard to compete, and it's more likely to be successful. That's sort of the guiding principle behind a cleaning treatment. A weeding treatment is really similar, but it's usually mediated by a desire to get rid of a non-native invasive species or something. So a cleaning treatment is more like a hardwood species that's less desirable for our objectives competing with a hardwood species more desirable for our objectives, and we remove that less desirable species. A weeding treatment is more like we have undesirable interference that is totally unacceptable that we're removing. So let's talk about that conceptually. Before a cleaning treatment, let me move there we go. So before a cleaning treatment, you have these desirable seedlings, but they're competing and occluded in some cases by overtopping less desirable species. By simply removing those less desirable species in this early stage, these are free to grow and they are off to the races. They can compete amongst themselves for success, but you have greatly influenced the species composition from very little of this species succeeding to most of this species succeeding on the site. As you might imagine, that's intensive and it happens on a very small scale, one thing at a time. In practice, here's what that might look like. This is a post Shelterwood harvest where we're trying to regenerate a mixed oak stand. Notice that we have some small seedlings of maples. We have small oak seedlings in this stand, but overtopping it are much larger, faster growing, different growth strategy, black birch. So in this case, looking for some of these oak seedlings and maple seedlings that are likely to be competitive, but might just be competing a little bit too closely with some of those birch. by removing the birch, we give them a fighting chance. So here is another example in an Allegheny hardwood stand. There's a lot of pin cherry and some birch in this stand as well, overtopping black cherry, oak, sugar maple, and some other desirable species. Starting with this condition, here's the operator removing one thing at a time to try to just get a little bit of space for those desirable and vigorous seedlings that have been identified at a very small operational scale. And then the recovery process, again, much more desirable species mix that has occurred 1 year later in this stand. So doing this activity costs money. It's a lot of work, but the overall species composition in this stand is much more favorable. This competition is happening anyway. Lots of death is happening anyway, but where we do nothing, we're likely to lose what's most desirable at this stage. So early stand tending is hugely important for the future species composition. If we think a little bit later, so we're past that early stand condition, we can start thinking a bit more intensively with a similar concept about doing those individual selections of winners and losers. And this is where crop tree concepts come in. It's still an intermediate treatment. It's still young enough or early enough in the stand that it's almost certain to be pre-commercial. And it is also very intensive because you're making selections on a stem by stem or group of stem by group of stem basis. So that intensity is still there for crop tree. Crop tree can happen as early as maybe 15 years into the stand development, and it can happen much later. We can do crop tree 40, 50 years in, but early crop tree has this critically important opportunity to influence crown dominance. So if you have a tree that's a great species and it's looking pretty good, but it's not likely to become a dominant stem, by giving it more free to grow room, more light resource early in the process, it has a better chance of reaching that main canopy. So this is not just the ability to influence future species composition, but also dominance potential of one stem at a time. And so this is what a stand at that stage looks like. Maybe they're 3-5 inches in diameter. But here we have an example where this is northern red oak. It's in a fairly strong, maybe weakly strong codominant position, but it's being occluded on a couple of sides by faster growing species that have a different growth strategy. And so by opening up the conditions around that stem, we have the opportunity that this red oak will make it into the main canopy rather than being relegated for the future for the rest of the stand's rotation in a suppressed or weak intermediate position. So put another way, he's just all he needs is a little light, but they grow faster, no dice. If we look on the right, this sort of conceptual model over here, if we selected these as our most desirable stems based on form, vigor, species, and future potential, they're all like pretty close to being in the main canopy, but they look like they may lose because they have a different growth strategy. We could selectively remove some of the stems around them. This birch is overtopping a few and it's occluding a crown over here. Same with this maple. We have 2 tulips, which would be desirable in this situation, but one of them is looking stronger than another, but still occluded by a birch. So in this example, we may selectively remove these 4 stems, leaving these having a little bit more room to grow, still maintaining a reasonable density, so they're not going to get tons of form defects and lots of epicormic sprouting, so branches from the side, but they're fine. We left this maple because it's not competing, so it's just going to be there providing some bowl shade and just hanging out. Here's what a crop tree example looks like. This is a little bit later crop tree. This is, I think, like a 30 or 40-year-old stand where we have a stem that's like doing pretty well and it's up in the main canopy, but it would benefit from a crown release and it has the potential to put on more wood, become a higher quality or a larger tree. So releasing it on 3 sides in this case creates enough space that even in a few years, the crown will expand to fill that gap. We're not creating a big hole in the canopy. That will be filled within a few years, but that tree will benefit greatly in the meantime. What could be lost by failing to do something in a stand like this is if you wait too long, the tree is sort of permanently relegated to a subordinate position and won't reach that saw timber potential. So reasons you want a tree to succeed and get into the main canopy could be mediated by a desire for timber potential, but also, massed production. So in this case, for wildlife, it would be beneficial to have this oak tree reach the main canopy. There aren't other oak trees. These are mostly birch trees here. Because we waited too long to give it a release, at this point, it's incapable of release. No amount of release events is really it's already lost. It's sort of too late for it to come up. So that's kind of, you have a certain window where crop tree management can really make a difference. And doing these early interventions is a really valuable practice to influence that species composition. There are a couple of really key issues here. Not every woodland health issue is important at all times of succession, but in this phase, vine management is really, really key, because a vine crawling up over a 20-foot tall tree is likely to pull the top off of that tree, and all of the hard work you've done to release it, gone. In addition, when you're doing these releases and these openings and causing mortality here, the light that sort of pulses, a vine can show up quickly and really become a problem quickly. So monitoring is important here. I won't talk too much about the specifics of vine management, but a combination of mechanical removals, herbicide removals, just depending on the situation, is really the way to do it. On that note, the same is true for how to deal with the removals of these small stems. You can do it with herbicide treatments or mechanical treatments, really sort of low intensity, but a lot of work, one at a time, removals that happen here. As professionals, you also have a really good eye for things like form and defects, as well as assessing the vigor of a stem. A non-vigorous stem that's really in a subordinate position, even if you release it, will probably not succeed and will not benefit from this type of activity. It's got to be sort of ready to go and close to being successful. It just needs a little bit of help. So you as a professional are good at sort of picking out what those might be. And the form issues are important here too, because you can have a fairly successful, good candidate for release, desirable species, but if it's got a lot of form defects and a lot of epicormic branching or big forks in it, if it's got that at this young age, those form issues are only going to get worse, and it's not likely to be a desirable tree in the future. So you have a good eye for that. A landowner probably doesn't. All right. So as we talk a little bit later in succession, we're still in that intermediate stage. So we're still talking about things will die unpredictably, or trees will self-thin. They'll compete with each other until some of them drop out. But if we sort of co-opt the mortality and place it where we want it, we can be successful. Thinning is sort of the last opportunity for that before we start thinking about truly mature stand management. Thinning happens more in the mid-successional range, really close to that mature stage, but not quite there, still intermediate. This is the first opportunity we have to do an activity that may be commercial or maybe pre-commercial. So most of what we've talked about costs money or breaks even. Most of what we've talked about costs money, to be more correct. But this is the first opportunity where you may break even, or you may actually make a little bit of money on a thinning. Multiple thinnings are possible within one successional sweep of a stand. So it all depends on how things are growing and what the potential is. The objectives of a thinning are very much the same as the objectives of crop tree and early stand tending. You're preempting that natural mortality, putting it where you want it, so that what is residual, what is left behind in the stand, can become more successful, be more desirable. You're retaining what you most want in that stand for some future option or future potential, whether that is wildlife habitat, desirable species composition for recreation, desirable species composition in good form for timber production. Any objective, that's kind of still what you want to retain and go toward. I'm going to talk a bit about this figure, which illustrates the concept of why thinning works. but I'm going to zoom in on it first. So to talk about thinning, I'm going to introduce a concept called relative density. Think of relative density as just how crowded is the crown space in a given stand of trees. In a totally closed canopy condition, every space is occupied by a crown. We're at 100% relative density. Everything's there's no room for anything new, any new crown space to happen. At 0% relative density, we're in an open field. We have no crown, and everything in between, right? So in a truly open condition, an individual tree, one tree at a time, is growing at its full potential because it has all the light resource it needs. It wants for nothing. And we can start to add trees to that stand for a while until that individual tree begins to see competition from its neighbors. And that doesn't happen until it's, maybe 30% relative density conditions. So this is the point at which crowns start to compete with each other for light. They may start shading each other. They may directly compete. From that point on, because of the competition that an individual tree has with its neighbors, the individual potential of that one tree to grow at each year goes down a little bit. So in very, very crowded stands, this is that like self-thinning, the process for hardwoods. In very crowded stands, a tree grows well below its potential. If it had more light, it would grow more quickly. However, when we think about the whole site, that open field, even though a tree is growing as well as it can possibly grow, the site is producing under its potential. So that site could produce a lot more wood, could produce more trees, but the growth on that site is below its potential because there aren't enough trees. It could produce more. At that onset of competition, even though the individual tree growth is really dipping, the growth overall in the stand continues to increase until there's so much competition that trees are really stagnating. And as a result, the stand overall stagnates and begins growing below its potential. But there is some optimal range where the site produces its optimum amount of production, even if individual trees are competing. And this is kind of that sweet spot where thinning makes sense. We can move back and forth in this relative density window from maybe like 60, 70% relative density back to 30, 40% relative density. And we won't sacrifice too much in terms of trees, individual potential to grow, but we can still sort of maximize the stand potential as long as we keep the density low enough. And those individual trees, we can give a boost if we lower the density without sacrificing too much of the stand potential. So that is the concept of thinning. We can kind of return to that if you would like, but it should be sort of a familiar concept. We've talked about it all along. This is what 100% relative density looks like. There's no real room for more stuff to happen here with crowns. Crown space is closed. Compare that to a stand with 60% relative density, and we see the potential for those crowns to expand. We see the potential for these individual trees to grow better. And while this stand at 100% relative density was stagnating, trees are competing so much that they're below their potential, but the stand is also below its potential. At this lower density, trees are capable of producing closer to their potential, but the stand overall is optimized. This is the concept behind thinning. And in a number of years, that relative density will increase again because crowns expand, and another thinning may be possible in a stand like this. Put another way, thinnings can focus also on removals of less desirable or poorly formed species. And thinnings in this sphere are also called timber stand improvement cuts. So this is an example of a thinning where the selections for removal, again, putting that mortality where you want it, happen in trees that have form defects, are of low quality, are of poor species, particularly if they're non-native species. I would retain the one conifer in a hardwood forest, but that's just my issue with this figure. Or trees that are so crowded that by removing this, there would be a release of its buddy over there. This is a concept called timber stand improvement, and it belongs in that conversation of thinning. A TSI cut is often pre-commercial activity, but it can sometimes have commercial potential. So here are two examples of thinnings, one of which is a pre-commercial thinning, a timber stand improvement cut, the point of which is to make sure that what's left here in the stand is the best of what we have and give it an opportunity to increase in size and become really happy and reach its potential, versus, and this is a commercial thinning, which happens a little bit later. The largest stuff that has been taken out here is in that smallest saw timber class, but we've still retained the best and largest things for the future. So these are two examples of thinnings that could dip into that commercial potential. So that's kind of what I wanted to cover in this intermediate space where we're fostering stand conditions toward maturity. I spent most of the time there. I'm going to very briefly touch on what differentiates a regeneration treatment from intermediate treatments, because these are also terms that are useful to kind of frame for folks so they understand what belongs where. Regeneration, as you likely know, can be natural or artificial. In this region, for the most part, we are depending on natural regeneration to create new forest conditions. And we do a lot of work to establish natural regeneration in advance of any sort of stand replacement activity. We call it advanced regeneration, not because it's advanced in its size, but because it's there before, in advance of any sort of major harvest activity. Regeneration can be direct seeds sprouting into seedlings. You know, we think about seed source. We also think about vegetative runners from things like beech. Aspen is another really good example of a vegetatively reproductive species, but also stump sprouts. Hardwood sprout from stumps. All hardwoods do, depending on the size, depending on the species. Some do more than others. But seedlings are also capable of sprouting when browsed off or nipped off. In fact, there are examples of oaks that have been dug up where the root system was about 30 years older than the seedling that was growing out of it. So it had just been repeatedly bitten off by deer. So we count those in our regeneration assessments. The challenges to regeneration, you know well. Deer browse is a real big one. We've already talked about the issue of light and competition with other vegetation. And in that sort of competitive space, we can talk about native competitors like hay-scented fern, American beech, striped maple, things like that, or non-native invasive species. And those are really key to control when you're doing a regeneration harvest. You have a bunch of fern under a pole stand that you're doing crop tree in, I really wouldn't worry about it too much. And this is kind of where that timing and successional context become really important to the decisions that you're communicating with a landowner. So generally speaking, most regeneration treatments are commercial. A clear cut takes existing advanced regeneration. So we have lots of regen in a forest stand. We do a one-shot stand replacing removal, and we release all of that regeneration. Clear cuts get a bad rap when we don't have advanced regeneration, and that's not a good example of a clear cut. A good clear cut has that regen, releases it. It's a huge gift to those species. And in the end, this is what it might look like. This is an overstory removal with some residuals. So that's kind of a familiar concept. Another that we talk about often is a Shelterwood treatment, which is similar to a clear cut, but takes it in a stepwise form. The purpose of this stepwise procedure is to open up conditions enough to foster more regeneration before that final removal. And again, we can talk more about that in the Q&A if you would like. But the other advantage to the Shelterwood is that what's residual, what's left behind here in this intermediate stage is often the best of what you've got. And its growth will continue and it will gain value before that final removal. This is what Shelterwood stages might look like. The beginning stand, a harvest. Again, these are all the good looking best trees that are waiting. They'll continue gaining value until you finally remove them in the final stage. And this is the same picture. If you're wondering why, it's because this is actually the end of a Shelterwood sequence. It just is indistinguishable at the end from a clear cut. Seed tree is similar to Shelterwood. It's not done a lot in hardwood systems, but Jonathan's going to talk about pines, and there may be some stuff relevant to seed tree that he may mention. It's like a really aggressive shelterwood, still a stepwise procedure, but it focuses on when you open things up more aggressively, it favors shade intolerant species, and in particular species that require a semi-nearby seed source in order to get established and grow. So this is what a seed tree density might look like. And again, that ending place is the same. There are versions of regeneration treatments that get really interesting and get into some of this, what's called uneven aged regeneration treatments, where you're removing some trees in a stand, but not others, and you're fostering multiple age cohorts. In this example, group selections remove gaps, large gaps in a stand, releasing patches of advanced regeneration. So again, it's always all about that regen, but you're maintaining mature forest conditions overall. And in some examples, you can actually go back and create new gaps after these trees begin to grow up, and you create this sort of complexity of conditions. Over time, that will replace the stand, and it's usually a commercial procedure, but you're creating that interesting structure. This is done a lot where you have more shade tolerant systems or where you want that complexity for things like habitat factors. This is an example of what one of those larger gaps might look like, and it mimics natural dynamics of something like an insect outbreak, or this is a gypsy moth defoliation mortality event, for example. But this is what one of those gaps looks like from an aerial perspective. The size can really differ depending on the species composition. Single tree selection is also an uneven aged management technique where one stem at a time, or maybe two stems at a time, are removed to, again, release seedlings. This is done on purpose to create gap structure and often to mimic old growth forest dynamics. The selections in terms of how you select what to remove are very specific and very rigorous in terms of what you do here. And it's important to differentiate single tree selection, which has those specific objectives, looks a little bit like this, from high grading, which is the most common practice that's done, unfortunately, which is taking the best and leaving the rest. True single tree selection, again, always focuses on the residuals. Thinnings can also kind of be mishandled and turn into high grades. If you start leaning toward that, taking the good stuff off, you're no longer doing a thinning, you're no longer doing single tree, you're high grading. It will still result in an uneven age system, but it's a less desirable condition. And often it can result in the total removal of a species because you're focusing on that upper echelon, the cream of the crop. In this case, an Allegheny hardwood stand, if you cut everything above a certain diameter, you remove all of the black cherry from that stand. So what happens next, right? I think that, this contextual structure is useful for sort of placing your explanation of what is happening and what should happen with a given silvicultural or health practice for a landowner, because it helps them understand where they're at and what might be coming down the pike and what the dynamics are at any given moment, evidencing why they should invest in something in a pre-commercial activity and pay for something that they can't see the direct benefit of right now, but understand that it's done in a way that kind of gives them some control over these natural processes. And in all cases, it's important to say the stand potential and the dynamics that are happening are sort of one thing, and whatever the landowner wants is the other. And the recommended silvicultural practice has to be right in the middle of those two things. And that's I think, a useful contextual concept to offer as well. So I'm going to shut up and quit talking, and Jonathan's going to talk a bit more about pine management and sort of place it still in context of some of that successional spectrum with some important differences from what I talked about with typical hardwood management, given some pine dynamics.
Yeah, so thanks a lot, Sara. My job here really is to talk just a little bit about what we see on the landscape, because many of you work on properties and you see hardwood stands areas and you see pine plantations. And I just want to kind of point out a few differences here, just a few minutes to kind of help you maybe understand, some of the differences between how those systems work and why we see some of the things we see. When you look at this photo, you see a lot of squares there with green trees, and those are, basically areas of pine that came back on old agricultural fields, in contrast with the hardwoods that are out there. So, but to make up these areas are very different, and their opportunities are different. And Sara spent a good bit of time, talking about succession, and obviously those first species, as you go through the process of succession, a lot of changes take place in the soil. There's organic matter development, there's mycorrhiza, all the kinds of things that happen that prepare the site as you get this natural progression, of trees and shrubs coming in, the more intolerant ones first, some of the hardwoods that she mentioned here, poplar and cherry, but also pine in a lot of areas of pine. And I got to realize that we're talking to folks from Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland, where a lot of it is hardwood areas, but there's also a lot of pine areas as well. So I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about pine plantation management and how that differs from this normal stage of succession, okay, where you have this natural development. Because what we've done with when we start planting pine trees, and I'm going to stay a little out of the area of hardwood planting, because the hardwood planting we see, last week was spent on riparian buffer and tree planting. Is planting hardwoods is a new thing. I mean, we really never used to plant hardwoods except for maybe black walnuts up until the late 90s, when all this focus came in with planting hardwoods. But pine management has been around for a long time, and once we impose a pine planting on an area, we've kind of, we've set the stage, for succession. We've changed the process, okay, because we've added these species and we've added them at a certain density that's going to totally impact the way that area is going to develop. So you're altering ecological succession by basically arresting, in many cases, hardwood succession, so the pines can succeed. And as the process goes on, if we're focused totally on pines, they'll actually go in and kill the hardwood trees that try to compete with the pines. So you were imposing this management regime where, when we have hardwood stands, as Sara so well put, you have all these silvicultural options and these progressions, and it's just a little bit different. She made the point that, tree density decreases over the time. So, in an area that's undergoing natural succession, you can end up start with 10 to 20,000 trees per acre. You end up with maybe 100 or 150, okay? And that's because of the natural process of going for light. And those trees are at all different spacings, they're different species, and they tend to kind of, self-select. They're constantly adjusting in that dynamic as they fight for light. But with pine, it's a little bit different, because we've actually established where those trees are. They're on centers of so many feet apart from each other. So we've set the stage, we've set the regime by which they're going to compete for light, and then it ends up with a different type of forest, and that I want to make a few points about. And you see a lot of this. A lot of times, if you work on properties, you'll see where there was a white pine. There was a lot of white pine planting that was done in the, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, maybe more. And all these trees are very close together, and a lot of times they used to plant them very close together, 6 to 8 feet on center. And you contrast that with a natural hardwood forest, which, as that process of succession took place, the trees naturally combated with each other for light. And again, you got more than one species. They kind of sort each other out. Not to say that, like Sara said, they definitely benefit from thinning, because they can be too much competition. But planted pine forests tend to retain that high stocking that they were planted with, because they tend to be genetically very similar, same species. And a lot of times that can lead to a lot of insects and disease problems, and definitely a lack of understory development. If thinning is not done, and a lot of times when you work on properties and you see some of these areas, that's what you see. You see areas that were planted, sometimes at very high densities, they were never thinned. There's nothing growing underneath them, and because they were never managed in the future, after they were planted. So just to give you a quick I used to work down in Virginia, so I'm familiar with pine management, and you can grow, a crop of pine trees in many cases in a person's lifetime, unlike hardwoods. But this is the process. You either have an open field, or perhaps it's an existing pine area or hardwood area that was clear cut, and then you establish it either usually by planting. You're planting genetically improved seedlings, and then you're going to go through a number of thinnings as certain milestones are reached. How Loblolly pine and white pine grow is pretty well understood, and a lot of these things are by prescription and things like that. And over time, you get a mature stand, it's harvested, and you start the cycle again. Okay, and so in many areas of the area that we're talking about, we get down into the southern areas, many of these pine forests dominate in many of these areas. So in the case of pine, pine, of course, can regenerate from seed. One thing to always remember is that hardwood trees sprout, pine trees don't. So pine trees rely upon typically windblown, regeneration like you see on the left, but typically when most areas are planted with pine, they're planted like when you see things on the right, either bare root, genetically improved seedlings. And this isn't genetically modified. They're just, selections from the best trees in an orchard and to improve the growing stock. So, and most is done through even age, like clear cuts for the top most pine management. And the reason for that is pretty clear, because like Sara said, pine species, for the majority of them, they require full sunlight to grow, and they're just not going to grow in the shade of other trees. So you have to open up the canopy, and then the question becomes, well, how big is the hole in the canopy? Well, is it going to be a half acre, an acre? Is it going to be 5 acres? You can argue about that, but the light conditions have to be met for them to grow. So again, just looking at the stages along this pattern here, the descriptive pattern, we have a clear cut over here on the right, an area that was cleared. The area was planted. The trees start to grow. In many cases, in really strict control, they would actually come in and spray after a couple of years to kill the hardwoods, stop the hardwoods, because the hardwoods want to take over, okay? And they try to keep them out purposefully. And as time goes on and the trees get too heavily stocked, to come in and thin out a couple rows and down to a certain stocking level, so that the trees, the canopies, can be able to expand and to grow. And at some point, you have a mature stand and it's harvested, just like you see here. That's pine management. It's very prescriptive. Hardwood management, not so much, because you have more than one species. You have all these different species and all these different site factors. So I think it requires a lot more knowledge, I would say, a lot more skill, actually. So you can plant on harvested land like you see on the left here. You can plant like you see here on an old farm field of some sort or another. And, this is what it kind of looks like on the lower left when the area is not thin. There's no light getting through. There's no understory development. So the point I'm making here is that if you're going to be involved with tree planting or with planting of pine trees, realize that with the trees that you put out of the ground, that they typically going to have to be managed in the future. Otherwise, you end up with things like here on the left. This is actually Norway spruce, but and typically what you'll see in many places is like what you see over here. This is an old white pine planting, and basically the trees kind of never really thinned themselves out to the extent that they just kind of everything just competed so completely, and the top started to fall out, and it just became a total mess. And at this point, there's not a whole lot to do. That's because, kind of not following the rule of managing these areas and thinning them out after they're grown, after they're planted. So, my point here is that tending or thinning is essential in pine plantations. And in terms of wildlife habitat, in southern pine systems where a lot of pine is grown, this thinning process, like you see on the upper right, creates all this light, creates a lot of wildlife habitat. And so you have vast improvements in habitat for deer and other species. In fact, a lot of quail management takes place on young pine plantings before the canopies start to close. So again, you want to kind of avoid what's on the lower left. But again, this takes the involvement on a scale like this, typically of a a professional forester. And on Thursday, we're going to hear from Tom Robertson, who works on smaller acreages with a harvester as well. And that's one of the things I'll just plant is that I realize most of you are not forestry professionals, but you work with clients that have these types of properties or challenges, and that knowing a professional forester that you can call and bring in when you have a client whose woods basically need more effort or more work that you could do, you know, with the types of things we talked about with, you know, crop tree management and things like that. That's a good contact to have. So this is some of the thinning equipment that's used in the case of pine. This is big equipment. There's no question about it. So this is an operation, to say the least, and many things are done under a written forest stewardship plan. But there are some opportunities on smaller acreages, and you'll hear about that on Thursday, correct? And other thing, there's a big movement these days in many cases for landowners who don't necessarily want complete pine stands. They are planting pine plantations at lower densities with the expectation that there is going to be a greater mixture of hardwood and pine, not just all pine. They want the values that come from the mast and other aesthetics that come from hardwood. They're not so intent on the income side of it. So planting lower density of pine when this initial planting is done is another strategy, and then allowing, you know, native hardwoods to come in. And this is a scene from the eastern shore of Maryland, and you can kind of see on the left here, this is obviously a pine plantation. And on the right, this is kind of a mixed stand of pine hardwood. I think most of this came in naturally. Down there you have, you know, pine that comes in naturally, loblolly pine. So has a different look to it. Obviously it has different utility for wildlife and even for recreation as well. So those are some compromises that can be made. So just in conclusion, I would just make the point that, you know, planted pine forests tend to maintain the same type of density. They don't tend to sell thin like hardwoods do. So what you start with in many cases are the number of stems that are going to be there, and that can create real issues with overstocking and issues with forest health. And if thinning is not likely after planting, consider some wide spacing perhaps to allow natural regeneration to provide a mix of pine and hardwood. And like I said, you know, pine thinnings on a commercial level is logging, and most folks here are not loggers, and this is where it pays to have a professional relationship with a professional, licensed professional forester who can perhaps work with clients that you may have that have more extensive woodland areas and are interested in doing some more extensive harvesting to meet their goals than you can actually deal with. And again, if you have very small areas, you know, some of these pines could be felled to open them up. So that is an opportunity. So with that, I am done, and I think I'll unshare my screen and see if we have some questions.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. We do have a number of questions that folks have typed in. So Sara said she had been discussing a couple of them with folks in the chat, but we'll go ahead and jump right into them. Christopher asks, is there any primary, and that's in quotes, succession, i.e. virgin forest, square footage in Pennsylvania, i.e. areas that have never been disturbed by man, only natural disturbances? And Sara,
yeah, I think it's useful to kind of differentiate what I was calling back to as an ecological principle of primary succession with what we often call primary forest, secondary forest, tertiary forest, which is just a convenient thing that we use as managers to talk about the rotations that are most referential to us. Primary succession is truly like glacier comes through, and vegetation, vegetation forms from soil. It takes thousands of years to result in that first forest. And secondary succession is basically we have a vegetated state, but then we create new forest rotations over and over. Primary succession is Hawaiian Ohialehua growing out of lava rock, right? So I think it's very unlikely we have primary forests from primary succession in Pennsylvania. But what we do have are remnant forests that are in a comparatively less disturbed state and don't match the typical species mix that we assign to secondary stands in Pennsylvania, which is most of the mid-successional stands that we're used to seeing. So when we talk about sort of this person in their question used the term virgin forest, they're probably talking about old growth systems that are white pine, hemlock dominated systems that we typically refer to as old growth. There are those forests in the region, but again, they have still seen their share of disturbance, including man-made disturbance. And so it's, you know, prior to our reference point of European colonization, there was still active forest management occurring. There were fires, there was harvest practices, there was a lot going on that influenced forest structure. So I don't know of any example of a truly undisturbed forest condition that exists anywhere.
Yeah,
Jonathan, anything to add? Sorry.
yeah, when I read that, I was also thinking about Native American management because we tend to forget that sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next question. I took forestry classes years ago and heard the old climax forest model. Heard that model that we were taught is dead, yet succession is still clearly a thing, both observationally and scientifically. Are the two not tied together?
The climax forest model is kind of predicated on that highly shade tolerant system self-replacing with these small gaps of one or two trees that release some younger trees, and it's sort of a perpetuating condition. What allows for that to happen is a general atmosphere of low deer density, no other competitive changes in terms of what may occupy a given gap, and truly hands-off non-management and truly hands-off situations in which that sort of climax structure perpetuates itself, I don't believe exist anymore, because there are so many factors influencing what happens when disturbance occurs in forests. But there are, active silvicultural practices that I talked about, like with uneven age management, with single tree selection or group selection, that can mimic those conditions and create longer rotations or those complex structural conditions that are typically kind of emulate the climax forest model. So yeah, I'm not surprised that you learned that model is dead, because I think that model is predicated on the concept that we do nothing and that happens. That doesn't really occur in our systems anymore. But we can still use that model to inform our management strategies to create habitat conditions that call back to that.
Okay, the next question, is the ecological strategy of oaks, when left to their own devices, to outlive maples and birch?
No, the ecological strategy of oaks directly competing with maples and birch is to die underneath maples and birch of starvation from light, unfortunately. Where oaks are successful sort of on their own terms are on sites that are very difficult sites for those faster growing species to get established. Droughty sites, rocky sites, ridge tops, that kind of situation. In those areas, oaks can directly compete and outcompete maples and birch. But on more mesic sites, on higher quality sites, maples and birch next to an oak established at the same time will almost always beat the oaks. Oaks have a strategy where they put more growth into their root system first before they shoot up. Maples and birch just go up for the most part. They still create roots, but they're really focused on getting up and capturing light. So situations where oaks succeed are often where we have helped sort of use that root strategy to their advantage. Some situations like this are when we do prescribed burning, which will kill anything that's not adapted to fire, that doesn't have its cotyledons underground like oaks do. which is not capable of that sort of sprouting after a fire with that big root stock as oaks are, and some pines as well, hickories. There are a number of species that have that strategy, but also, repeated sort of fostering of these big root systems. Sometimes when I talked about fostering advanced regeneration, we may work 15 or 20 years before we do an overstory removal to make sure we have very strong oaks that are capable of benefiting from a release before we release them. So no, they don't, it's not so much that they outlive those other species, it's that there are specific sets of conditions under which they succeed. And as managers, we try to emulate those conditions if that's what we want.
Yeah, and a lot of those, oak sites that we have now that weren't necessarily poor sites, but were decent sites. The oaks were able to establish there because there was repeated fire. We didn't have the high deer densities that we have now.
That's a big one.
And the big thing, of course, is maintaining oak stands is the constant challenge, because you don't have those conditions that we had, and everything else is more successful. Can outgrow it.
Yeah, deer love to browse oaks. I mean, if the forest, if a regeneration layer of a forest is a buffet, the oaks are the Sunday bar for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Oh.
Thank you. Next question from Lauren. Is it recommended to do mixed plantings of pine and hardwood for habitat creation? If so, what would be a good ratio?
Well, and that's one reason why some people do mixed stands, because there's more wildlife benefits, because you have some oaks, you have some hickories, you have other types of hardwoods in there that provide habitat. You have more open space between the pine canopy, so you get more stratification, you get more understory development. Where with pine, because completely with pine at normal densities that it's planted, the canopy starts to close and then there's nothing underneath unless it's thin. So in terms of the ratio, I'm not exactly sure of that, but I mean, many pine plantings, are somewhere probably around 400 trees to the acre, at least. And you don't need that many, but the problem is when you plant less, then of course you're going to have a lot more openings, and you're going to have more opportunities for other hardwoods and other things to come in. And I think it just depends what the landowner really wants. So I'm not sure I can actually provide a ratio, but the basic idea is the less pine you have, the more hardwood you're going to get.
If I could add to that a little bit too, in hardwood dominated systems, it's not just hardwoods. There's often a conifer component
right
in a hardwood stand. And so we would make silvicultural decisions based on a hardwood system, but we would still consider those pines and other conifers. And so, a lot of times we would, for habitat objectives, which I think the question was about habitat objectives, we would preferentially retain islands of conifers into the future stand. We might prioritize, retaining or releasing patches of regeneration of that species if that's a condition that we wanted for complexity and diversity. So recommendations around maintaining those conifer components through hardwood rotations is also true of hardwood systems for those same habitat objectives.
Right, because those hardwood systems you're talking about have this pine component, like white pine or some Virginia pine.
Yep.
And that's in contrast to where maybe this person's talking about, where you actually are, I have a field, I'm going to plant loblolly pine, or,
Right.
And how many I think the question is, how many loblolly pine trees should I plant, with the expectation that I'm going to get some mix of pine hardwood. And, it's been a while since I've done that, but it's, probably at least 100 or 200 trees to the acre, I would think, but it's hard to say exactly.
Might it also have something to do with the wildlife they want to encourage?
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think in general, you're talking about, getting understory development, which is going to benefit a whole range of those species, whether all the species that use those understory layers. So I think a majority of species are going to benefit compared to a typical crown enclosure in a pine stand where, it's just, there's really no understory vegetation. There's some escape cover maybe, but there's really nothing else. So
Which again, like that structure could be useful to certain wildlife species. Every
Right.
structure is good for
Right.
something. And, there are birds that we see, they really love that Shelterwood sequence, that mid-stage Shelterwood. So, there's a period of like 10 years where they're really happy and they love that. But, it all depends. So every structural condition is good for something. It doesn't, we don't have to have all that structure in one place at all times, although there are situations where that's useful.
Right.
Okay, Richard would like to know, do you know of any tree management like this for roadsides after a vegetation removal?
I'm not sure exactly.
I'm guessing he's talking about pines or pine hardwood systems.
That's the extent of the question. So I'm not sure if he's talking about invasive species removal or
Well, we tend not to manage our roadsides very much. I mean, interestingly, I've been to Austria a few times, and the last time I was there was a couple of years ago. And compared to the United States, like they don't have as much land, but every, that area along the right of way along the roadside of like 40 or 50 feet is managed, to the highest level. They're cutting out individual trees and replanting. It's amazing. But, most of our roadsides are really not managed to any degree. What they have done in a lot of areas is they've stopped, they mow out a certain number of feet, which, instead of planting trees, so for grassland birds and things like that. Of course, then the birds, I guess, can fly in front of the cars, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, just generally, especially on roadsides, invasives are a big issue. Just any disturbance invites invasives, any disturbance, even a planned disturbance. And especially on roadsides where it's a travel corridor, there's a lot of light, side light, even in a mature stand, and a lot of people, accessing it depending on the access issues in that area. Stuff, seeds move on vehicles, seeds move on people, seeds move on animals. So those edge habitats are very challenging.
And Adam Downing pointed, and he's right, because I worked on right-of-ways for a number of years in New York, and right-of-way management is a whole discipline in itself, and because its objectives are very different in terms of safety and security, and for power lines. It's a whole different range of things, and you're trying to fit in maybe some other wildlife objectives if you can, but the overall objective is those other things more related to transportation or electricity or whatever.
Yeah, there's a whole other set of silviculture about hazard trees and safety, and even like sanitation and post forest health disturbance kind of stuff that I didn't get into. So the list I gave you today was not comprehensive. It's sort of just guiding principles, but yeah, it is, right of ways are a whole other world.
Right. I think there's another question there.
In overmature forests, is it possible to plant in the natural area? Sorry about that one, just jumped. Is it possible to plant in the natural open areas to try and create an understory that will form a future stand?
A couple of things. So and everything entirely depends on your objectives. And to define a stand as overmature implies that you're thinking of a rotation length based on timber potential or you're past sort of the objective that you want for the stand, and you're needing to set things back. In an overmature stand, that question's gone. I just wanted to read it again.
Yeah, where's that question?
So that's one thing. I think generally when we talk about what you might be thinking of as an overmature stand, I would call it more of an extended rotation. So it's just beyond what you would typically think of as a normal timber rotation. It's an older forest, old growth or late successional forest. And that's sort of how I'm going to answer this. But Cheryl, if that's not what you're thinking, then correct me and write back. Planting in open areas within stands is extremely difficult.
Yeah.
I think it's almost impossible in my experience. I hear that you learned a bit about riparian establishment and the many challenges associated with that. You have a big open field and everything at your disposal to try to help those succeed. You have all those challenges and more in a mature stand. I think planting is really not the way to go. typically, if there is an open area within a stand, and if there's a gap of light that has created that open area, something will grow there. And whether it's what you want or not is a big issue. And that's kind of where those stand tending principles come in. And in those uneven age systems of group selection and single tree selection, visiting those gaps and doing even some of that early crop tree or early cleaning and weeding treatments in those gaps to influence what's going to succeed there is really important. But generally, whenever there's a disturbance, any light-seeded species, anything that's there and waiting to take advantage of the gap will take advantage of the gap. So I would say no, don't plant it. The one situation in which I might recommend that is if there is a very particular species that's really important to maintain or introduce based on like diversity objectives that you really want to have, then maybe, but you have to protect that from deer. You have to baby it like it's your child. So I would generally not recommend underplanting in stands, though it is possible. Jonathan?
No, one thing I'd say is that one thing you can do is this, and Sara said that, you know, things come in, and one of the things you do once you can identify some of these seedlings like of oak or hickory or something that's a desirable seedlings, in a lot of cases, in a lot of these smaller woodlots, there may be some of these scattered around, you know, even amongst multiflora rows and everything else. And one of the things you can do is, if you find these, is to get a tree shelter, you know, and put something around it and clear around it. And it's kind of that crop tree concept of actually, you know, creating some space for that thing to grow, because otherwise it's just going to get lost. So that's one thing you can do in some of these smaller areas, is seek out and protect anything that might be a desirable tree of some sort. And even though there's a lot of invasives around.
Okay, we have a pair of questions from John that are related. Why do we see birch taking over oak stands when they are opened up? Is that why birch takes over oak stands?
Yeah, so the site conditions I mentioned before, where birch and maple tend to do well compared to where oaks tend to do well, that's definitely part of it. So if it's a site that is a mesic site or a pretty good growing site, and you have both birch and oaks capable of seeding and producing seedlings and regenerating, the birch will win probably on that site, just because it has a faster growth strategy and it occupies that space quicker. And that early stand competition dictates the whole future. That's why we do those pre-commercial cleaning and weeding treatments in some cases. The birch, go back to the questions, hold on, make sure I'm answering them specifically. Yeah, why do we see birch taking over oak stands when they're opened up? Another main thing about birch is it's a light-seeded species, and one birch tree is just throws seed everywhere. Whereas, you know, acorns, it's a 1 or 2 year, depending on red or white oak cycle to mature acorns. You need bumper crops, which are periodic, and you may only get a good large crop of acorns once every 7 years, maybe. And, you know, even that can be compromised by weather factors. So, you know, birch are always producing seed, tons of it all the time. It's built to respond to those disturbances from, you know, ecological strategy perspective. Oaks take a lot more fostering and time, and they do that downward root growth first. So, you know, oaks are just, they're high maintenance in a way, and birch are just like, we're good, we're going. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, you know, and a lot of oak management, I mean, because I did a lot of that stuff, was, you know, a lot of the recommendations for regenerating oak were based on, you know, counting the number of trees that might sprout, but also the number of advanced regeneration that were like 4.5 feet tall in the understory, because the assumption was those trees would have a big enough root system and enough carbohydrates underneath that they could grow competitively with the things around them and make it. But, you know, if you walk around the woods, it's because of deer, you know, and other things, especially the deer, it's hard to find that type of regeneration anymore, which explains a lot why these areas don't go back to oak. You know, there may be a few oak stumps, you know, oak trees, but, you know, even oaks oak trees, they, especially white oaks, after they get 10, 12 inches diameter, they don't sprout much either. So, it's just a matter of the regeneration strategy of oaks versus the birch, like you said.
That assessment of the competitive potential of oaks can, you look for the 4 or 5 foot tall oaks that are ready to go, but you also, we also assess them based on the root collar diameter. So if it's got a huge root system, then like it's got the reserves and it might be able to shoot up. But again, we have to protect it from deer browse, because if it's got a huge root system and it's only this tall, it's because it's been continuously munched on by deer.
Okay, we have a couple more left and it's about 8:27, so we'll go ahead and work on those. Brad says, I've heard that planting non-native evergreens like Norway spruce is acceptable practice and can be beneficial in avoiding deer browse. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I don't have as much experience. I mean, the deer will nibble them off as they will anything else, from what I've seen in the areas they've been planted. Is that different up? I don't know if you have anything different up where you are in Pennsylvania there, but if you have high enough deer pressure and you're going to put pine in the ground unprotected in this day and age, I'm not sure that they're all going to suffer.
Yeah, I think the thing about any plantation is not just that you plant something that's resistant to deer, but you're planting for a future condition that you want. So if what you want is a Norway spruce stand, go for it. But I think in general, our objectives with any intentional, planting is expensive, it's labor intensive, and a lot of what you plant fails. So if you're going to invest that much in it, you obviously want to create a very specific condition. I think you choose the species and the seed source, seedling stock for the site based on your objectives, and then you do everything you have to do to protect it. So in a large scale planting, it might be better to fence the entire area than to just pick something deer resistant. One situation in which Norway spruce underplantings are useful, it's been talked about as a sort of functional hemlock replacement in some areas. And so that might be an exception, but even then, I think a diversity of coniferous species might be more interesting because there is no direct functional replacement for hemlock, in my opinion.
We tried to experiment with that with the DNR Forest Service to plant some Norway spruce because they're very more tolerant of shade too. They're more shade tolerant than a lot of other pines. But the deer ate them all off. So, like you said, if they're not protected, it's not going to matter. And they were history. So, yeah.
Okay, Joe would like to know, are there general recommendations for timber production, along with habitat management for tree planting, as in types and density, etc., for the various slope types, north, south, east, west facing, etc.? For instance, looking at water availability / sun exposure time in conjunction with tree density and soil quality, and using that to create general plans.
I don't know if you, but basically, I mean, any planting job, any tree planting is going to be based on looking at all those things. Like Sara said, with the objective in mind, what's going to be, what's possible to do. So I guess I would say all those things are considered for whatever's going to be done. So, north slopes are going to have different exposure than south slopes and, all those kinds of things. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Sara, but I mean.
Yeah, and a lot of that too is just understanding sort of where forest types in your area tend to form. So you have certain forest composition in different species groups on one aspect or another, and soil conditions influence that. I talked a bit about how site factors can influence oak success versus birch success, all that kind of stuff. The other thing I'll add is just in big planting projects where success is really, really important. Another thing folks are increasingly considering is this provenance of the seedlings that they plant. So if you buy a whole bunch of seedlings from Virginia and you're planting them in New York, they may not be successful because we know genetics plays a big role in success of vegetation. So, choosing a provenance of seed source or seedling source that's appropriate to the site is another thing if you have that luxury, but sometimes you're just stuck with what you can get.
I would just say in general that we've become very planting happy, almost drunk on tree planting, because, like I said, we've always planted pine trees. We know how to do that. But this whole movement for planting hardwood trees has been a learning process. It's many times just not successful because, the ecological changes that take place, the reason hardwoods come in is because of ecological changes that take place in the soil and everything else that prepare the site. And when you take an oak seedling or something, you put it in the middle of an old agricultural field or a hay field, I mean, you're fighting the ecology of the area. And it's just, so I just always warn folks that planting hardwoods is not easy, and it takes many years of maintenance to be successful. The tree planting programs have recognized that and tried to secure the funds to provide that maintenance, but many times sometimes it's just not there. So just take that with a grain of salt.
The concept of fighting the system is, I think, an important point to end on, because all of the silvicultural practices that I talked about are working. You have a system that you understand, and you're just tapping it in the way you want to go. It's so much easier to work with something that's there than to create something out of nothing. And it's so much more expensive and difficult too. Often, if we're doing a major hardwood planting project, it's possible we're correcting a past mistake. So it's much easier not to make that mistake in the first place and plan for regeneration and plan for working with the system you have and understanding the successional phase that you're in than to start from nothing.
Instead of trying to plant 300-400 oak trees, you're better off just to plant 20 or 30 and realize they're going to be around there for the next forest as a seed source, not for this one maybe. But anyway, there's a lot of ways to look at that. So
Julianne, you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I do have one resource, and I was just starting to put it in the chat. And that's a volume, actually 2 volumes from the U.S. Forest Service. And it's delving more into the sylvics of each individual species. So there aren't charts that can show you slopes and things like that, but it does list for each species where the research has shown their preferred companion plantings, for example, slope aspects, things like that. And so I'll put the one in the chat and then I'll get to the other. Okay.
It's a silviculturalist Bible, basically. I mean,
and you can download it.
It's downloadable. It's right on. If you put in sylvics of forest trees into Google,
North America.
North America,
yeah,
you'll come up with it.
And it's periodically updated, to consider, the changing dynamics of things like birch and cherry, the stuff we know. When we look at the landscape, something's different now. And I think they're updating it. They're in the process of updating it now. So
we're going to grow forests of tree of heaven now. We're going to getting rid of all those maples and other stuff, all that other stuff. And okay. I think we've answered all the questions, right?
Yes, I believe we have. So what I will do is leave the contact information up there for just a second for Jonathan and Sara, and you can contact them if you have any other questions. But we do have 2 more things to talk about before I let everybody go. First off, when we finish off tonight, when you close your Zoom, there will be a quick 2-question questionnaire that we'd like you to fill out. Basically, the same questions we've done the last few sessions, but we want to make sure you give us some feedback on that. And before I let you go, remind you that our next presentation, the 6th webinar in the series on Woodland Management Week, will be harvesting on single or multiple properties. Thursday night, 7 o'clock, right back here at the same place, same time. And we hope to see you then. So on behalf of Sara and Jonathan and Agnes behind the scenes and Adam and Julianne and Dave and all the Woods in Your Backyard professionals who are helping us out tonight, I want to say thank you. We've had a lot of great information, a lot of stuff to think about, and a lot of good input and questions as well. So we will see you back here Thursday night, 7 o'clock, and have a good evening, and we will see you then. Good night.